Her government jobs included Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and Counselor to the U.S. Trade Representative. She holds a Ph.D. in Government from the Harvard University and an M.A. from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Ellen Frost.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Heidi. And thank you all for coming. This is about the time when you could be home, you know, having your second martini, relaxing. Not only that, you've chosen to be here for an event that has ism in the title, as in Asia's new regional ism. I merely want to say in my own defense, and you know this if you've ever written a book, but once you turn over a manuscript to the publisher, they own it. I submitted any number of more interesting titles, but these days publishing is all about keywords and computer searches and what universities are teaching and so forth. So the book is indeed about Asia's new regionalism, but I hope to make the presentation tonight lively enough so that you will find it as interesting a topic as I do. You know, one way to look at what I'm going to talk about is that there's a lot of attention, almost obsession, to the rise of China. Lots and lots of attention here to the U.S.-China relations, China's competitive threat, and all of this kind of thing. But we don't think too much about what other countries are doing to cope with the rise of China, and that's an important theme in my book. What are Asians, who are, after all, very directly affected by China's rise, doing? And the integration movement, or regionalism, is one of the responses that I think we can learn from. And another question that sort of runs through the book is, and we can discuss this in our Q&A time, is the United States is excluded from this integration movement. Asians have formed a lot of organizations that I'll describe briefly that exclude the United States. And does it matter? Is it important? Should we be at the table? So those are sort of the bigger questions. I'm going to present 4 findings, and I'm going to give them to you all at once up front, and then visit all of them in turn, that I've selected from the book. The first finding is perhaps the most unusual in a book of this kind. I drew heavily on history and geography, as well as the usual sort of boring Washington mixture, you know, politics, economics, and security. I tried to make this book really interdisciplinary. And the first finding is influenced by history and geography in particular. It is that we are witnessing the resurgence of an older pre-colonial maritime Asia. Pry your mind loose from national borders, national boundaries for just a moment, and pretend that you're looking at Asia from space, outer space. My next door neighbor, Marianne Albiar, works at NASA, and NASA kindly supplies maps to Google Earth, and you can see what it is I'm talking about. I'm talking about the sweep of coastal communities and port cities, trading nodes located on ocean-accessible rivers close to the sea. This is where the spice trade took place. This is where the wealth and power of Asia has been and is now. This is where the investment is taking place. 90 to 95% of investment into China, for example, is located in the coastal provinces. The world's 6 biggest ports, both container ports and cargo ports, are all located in Asia. India has now resurfaced from 50 years of autarky and inward-looking policies to reconnect with this dynamism in maritime Asia. So that's sort of the first finding, I think, personally, I think that's sort of among the more interesting chapters of the book, or when I talk about that. But the other 3 findings really require wrapping your mind once again around national borders, because despite this maritime vitality, governments are, in the name of community building, are pursuing a top-down integration movement, or regionalism. Not spontaneous, bottom-up, market-driven coastal integration, but government-driven movement among rather artificial nation-states left over from the colonial era, some of them anyway. And so the second finding I have is that what governments are doing in the name of community building has as much to do with politics and security as it does with economics, and I'll explain that. And then finding number 3 is that this new regionalism or integration movement, community building, is an expression of the changing balance of influence in Asia. You've all heard about the balance of power. This is really about the changing balance of influence in Asia. And there's some very high-stakes diplomacy that's going on. Very subtle, often behind the scenes, but very important, and I would argue important for the United States. And that leads to my final finding, which is that despite the strategic importance of Asia and the importance of the movement that I describe in the book, the United States is out to lunch. Out to lunch. And for any of you who are not American-born, that means we're just not there. We're just not paying enough attention. One of the embassy people said to me, well, when is the United States going to get back from lunch? I thought that was a great question. First I said, January 2009, and I thought, probably not that soon. Not that soon, but anyway, we can discuss that. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about this pre-colonial maritime Asia, because it does have strategic significance as well as economic significance. It includes coastal Australia, by the way. Australia exports more to, a higher percentage of its exports from Australia go to Asia than any Asian country. Australia is very deeply involved in the economy of Asia and has a blue water navy that plays an important security role. So there's this older maritime Asia that includes India, and then there's sort of the new element of coastal Australia. A lot of the statistics that you see about Asia are really centered in the maritime regions, something like 16 of the world's 20 biggest cities. A similar proportion for ports and container ports and shipping and so on. There's a huge number of tourists that have begun moving around in Asia. China had only 8,000 foreign students back in the 1980s and now has 90,000 foreign students, and the number is rapidly growing. And other countries in the region are also finding that the cheaper transportation costs and lower, faster and cheaper information transmission costs are permitting a tremendous resurgence of contacts of all kinds, including criminal contacts, by the way. This is an area where there's a lot of piracy and crime. But in short, I argue that maritime Asia is the source of wealth and power. A few years ago, Jeffrey Sachs, who's an economist, looked at the maritime regions of Europe, North America, and temperate zone Asia. He found that although this territory was only about 5% of the world's landmass, it accounted for 37% of the world's GDP. And my guess is that that figure is even higher today. And of course it creates, within some of these countries, it creates widening income gaps and other kinds of political problems that we can discuss. Now you do hear a lot of talk about the Silk Road, but I'm dubious about this, despite the wonderful efforts of Yo-Yo Ma and others to revive the cultures of the Silk Road, which is just great. I don't see much moving over the Silk Road except tourism and energy. And I have an anecdote that helps to explain why seaborne trade, which is now about 90% of trade, is so much easier and cheaper, as well as cheaper than land-based trade. And the anecdote is, when is a camel not a camel? And the answer is when it's a truck. And the reason that I say that is that a Turkish photographer tried to recreate the Silk Road journey using a camel caravan, and he was shaken down at the border of Turkmenistan by one of these, Kalashnikov rifle-wielding customs agents who demanded $150 to let him cross the border. And that just goes on. Corruption and bribery and various, and even violence can go on in the Silk Road, whereas the maritime routes are really quite clear. So you get some funny examples of this new business. My favorite example of this sort of new wash of business around the region is that a customer in Sri Lanka noticed something called Mongolian Seafood. Now, think, what's wrong with this picture? Mongolia is landlocked. There is no Mongolian seafood. It was Mongolian-style seafood that was processed in Malaysia and sold in Hong Kong and Sri Lanka. So this is the kind of thing you get, which is quite a lot of fun. Anyway, so So I did bring in geography, and I did bring in history, and I looked at the concept of Asia